Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. What a magnificent room we're in. Welcome. Welcome to the Muslim Institute's annual Ibn Rushd lecture. The first of what we hope will be an annual feast of ideas, debate, dissent, and maybe some agreement as well. My name is Ehsan Masood and I'm a trustee of the Muslim Institute, and my role tonight is to introduce our topic, our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Amira Bennison, and then to take your questions at the end, after which we'll have some food. One of the aims of these lectures is to introduce and debate the relevance today of ideas and events from the past. Each year's lecture will be on a different topic, but tonight we're going to discuss the man himself, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, whose name we're honouring in the title of the series. Perhaps it's not going to be a surprise to anyone here that we live in a time of great tension between faith and reason, if I can put it in its most simplistic sense. But there has always existed a tension within religions, within all religions, and you could call it a tension of literalism. The tensions between those who interpret belief, human behaviour, or the content of texts in a very literal way, and those who are more selective. And there's an additional tension too, that's also existed for centuries, and that's the tension of what you might call plurality or difference. The tension of difference, I would say, is perhaps more prevalent, tighter, stronger among Muslims than it is amongst others. And it's sometimes something that I wonder if we'll ever really be able to get right. Islamic societies have always comprised believers and non-believers from a multitude of schools, traditions, ways of behaving, ways of living. But unlike other communities, it's probably fair to say that we find it harder to acknowledge that difference and harder still to celebrate it. You might be Sunni or Shi'i, you might belong to the many later incarnations of Islamic belief or practice. You may decide that belief isn't something for you. But if you want to remain part of an Islamic community, you're pretty stuck, because by common consensus there is only really one or a few modes of existence, one or a few ways to comprehend the meaning of God, or to interpret revelation, one way to define what it means to have an afterlife, one or a few ways to think about the nature of prophecy, and heaven help you, of course, if you choose to dissent. I was reminded of the quite incredible power of this consensus just quite recently by the story of the fall from official grace of Muhammad Assad, who many of you will know as being the writer and diplomat, published a translation of the Quran in 1980, and before that who wrote, of course, The Road to Mecca, a book that many Muslims and others have found to be quite inspirational. If there was ever an Islamic utopian of his time, one of those people would have been Muhammad Assad. He was born to an Austrian Jewish family. He converted to Islam, travelled extensively in Arabia, found a calling in the newly independent Pakistan, where he then became ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and later moved to southern Spain, where he died and is now buried in Malaga. For practically all of his life, he was revered, quite respected, until that is a most unlikely downfall, a downfall over the fact that he dared to be just that little bit different. If you're born into a Muslim household, it's quite likely you'll have learned the story of the Prophet's night journey, the Miraj, an event in which the Prophet in the dead of night journeys from Mecca to Jerusalem and then into the heavens before returning home in barely the blink of an eye. Now, in his translation, Assad agrees that the night journey was very important in a theological sense, but he adds that it was probably mystical, or mystic as he called it, and not physical. He was quite upfront about the fact that this is not the majority view of commentators, but it is held by an influential minority. This kind of careful caveating didn't really matter, because when the translation was published, all hell broke loose. The translator had committed that perhaps most cardinal of sins. He'd questioned something in the Holy Book, and for that he became a non-person in many of the countries where he was formerly very respected, including Saudi Arabia. Assad's translation went out of print quite quickly after 1980, and it's only just come back into circulation, but I haven't really checked if that particular phrase that he'd used is still there. Tonight we go 8 centuries further back, in Spain, to a period that many, including Muhammad Assad, saw as very much a multicultural golden age of convivencia, and we'll journey into the life of Ibn Rushd, remembered all over the world on street names, statues, postage stamps, but who also suffered towards the end of his life. Ibn Rushd was a jurist and a philosopher who found favour with the rulers of his day, but towards the end of his life was accused of heresy by his fellow scholars and exiled. In the Islamic East, he's kind of criticised sometimes for his defence of philosophy, but in Europe he's sometimes celebrated for the same thing. Tonight's lecturer, Dr. Amira Bennison, who's reader in the history and culture of the Maghreb and a fellow at Magdalen College at the University of Cambridge, will tell us more. She's the author of a number of books, the most recent of which is called The Great Caliphs, The Golden Age of the Abbasid Empire, and a book called Cities in the Pre-Modern Islamic World. Amira is a fantastic communicator, a great storyteller, and broadcasts regularly on television and radio. Many of you will have heard her on Thursday mornings on Radio 4 as a guest of Melvyn Bragg's In Our Time. She'll consider Ibn Rushd's life, his influence in Muslim and Christian circles. Who was he? How was he viewed in his own times? And what relevance does his philosophy and experiences, rather than his image, have for us today? Amira will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have about the same amount of time for Q&A, at the end of which we'll have a vote of thanks from the Muslim Institute's director, Merrill Davis. Merrill, can you raise your hand? There you are. And after which we can then retire for more conversation and for dinner. So on behalf of Merrill and the staff, the fellows of the Institute, my colleagues on the trustee board, the editors of the magazine Critical Muslim, which this month is all about Al-Andalus, so sign up. And also our sponsors, the Halal Food Foundation. I hope you really enjoy tonight's event. The Halal Food Foundation is, of course, the perfect sponsor for this event, which will provide you with much food for thought and sustenance for the soul. Ladies and gentlemen, Amira Bennison.
Well, first of all, of course, I'd like to thank the Muslim Institute for inviting me to give this first lecture in the series. It's a huge pleasure and an honour for me to be here. I'm very grateful to Ihsan himself for inviting me and talking to me about the topic and what we'd like to cover tonight. And I must admit, in a sense, I was slightly puzzled about this idea of Ibn Rushd, a man for our times, when I first thought about it, and I wondered in what ways he might indeed be a man for our times. And it did set me to thinking, and I hope we can explore some of the ideas that I'll throw out in the course of the lecture when it comes to the question and answer session. I started by thinking about Ibn Rushd himself as an exemplar and why he might be an exemplar in modern times, and how he's taken, what does he stand for people today. I know him as a historical character, not as a symbol, so I had to think how he was understood today. And I called to mind a conference I was invited to in Algiers around 2005 by the Haut Conseil Islamique in Algiers. And they very much presented Ibn Rushd as an emblem of open scientific and philosophical inquiry, whilst very much forgetting the age that he actually lived in, because whilst a lot of people have pointed to the centuries before Ibn Rushd